everyone. Thanks for joining today. This is the listening session about HB 920, the Urban Ag Incentive Zone Bill. We will get started in just a moment. Some folks are still trickling in, so if you wouldn't mind just dropping your name, your organization, association, farm, whatever sort of affiliation you want to include, and you can include that in the chat just so we know. And yeah, I guess your location as well is always helpful, so we know where folks are coming from. And we'll get started in just a moment. Thanks. So I think we will go ahead and get started. Again, today we are having a listening session about HB 920, the Urban Ag Incentive Zone Bill. And we are joined today by the sponsor of that bill, Rep. Rabb of the 200th Legislative District. Very glad to have him here with us today. And we, Rep. Rabb will take a little bit of time at the beginning of the presentation, providing a little more background information. I just wanted to start with a few housekeeping notes. So this presentation will be structured with, the listening session today will be structured with a few slides at the beginning, just to give you some background information about the proposal, and then we'll transition into a discussion portion of the presentation where we're encourage folks to turn on their video if they so choose, come off mute, and we're just asking that during the discussion portion, if you can use the raise hand feature, and we will call on you so that we can kind of keep a little bit of a flow here today. And this session is being recorded, so if you do come off mute or turn your video on, then your face and voice may be used in some, public materials that emerge from this recording today. So just wanted to give that note as well. And we have, as you can see from the chat, folks from all across the state today, very exciting. In addition to Rep. Rabb, we also have some folks from the PA Department of Ag, and farmers and other stakeholders from across the state. So very, very grateful for the diversity of voices that we will be able to hear from today during the listening session. So this event is brought to you by PASA. For folks that are not familiar with PASA, we are a nonprofit organization that administers farmer training, research, policy, peer education, and local food programs. We are also a network of tens of thousands of farmers, food system professionals, and change makers working together to advance regenerative and equitable agriculture at home in our communities. You can learn more about PASA at pasafarming.org, and this event is co-presented today with Rep. Rabb and his team. And again, we're very grateful to have this opportunity to weigh in on this piece of legislation. So we, I'm just going to say up front that this is a bit of an experiment. So we we haven't really done this before, but Rep. Rabb was really generous with his time and his willingness to engage with stakeholders who would be impacted by this legislation. And so we're just grateful that you're all here today to start this conversation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to the representative.
Thank you, Lindsay. Hey, folks, I'm Rep. Rabb out of Philadelphia. You can see from the slide a little bit about me. I have 68,000 bosses across 4 neighborhoods in Northwest Philly, and this is my 4th term. Looking forward to starting a 5th term when the new legislative session begins on December 1st. I've been on the Agriculture Committee for the same amount of time, so almost 8 years, and agriculture is not central to my district. I have a very urban district, but that should change. So this has been baptism by fire for me as someone who grew up in Chicago and who's embraced Philly as his home for the past 22 years. And so how I present and as a legislator and a public servant is I try to learn as much as I can so I can be the best representative for the people who are my constituents. And that means going outside of my comfort zone and going into agricultural communities that I've not been familiar with, being in Philadelphia and from basically everywhere else I've lived in the world. I've had very little connection to the people who grow my food. And so I feel very honored and a weighty sense of responsibility to significantly increase my knowledge base so I can be a better advocate, not just for my constituents back home, but for 13 million Pennsylvanians who rely on food and agriculture every day in every aspect of life. And so with that said, I've been particularly interested in finding ways to understand and embrace agriculture as it relates to the people I represent. So whether it's sustainable farming, regenerative, organic, or urban, innovations in the field, things that protect farm workers, things that lift up climate action and how environmental justice impacts food justice and food security. And all of these things, they're intertwined and very important for everyone. But because I do represent an urban constituency, my job is connecting the dots between the valuable work of agricultural experts and the communities I serve. And a lot of folks have never connected those dots. And because I've connected those dots fairly recently, given that this is not my background, I feel like I have a responsibility and a great interest in doing that for the people I represent who are busy, distracted, confused, curious. So this may be the bill that gets the most interest from my constituents who generally speaking are not listing agriculture in their top 10, top 20 things. And I think through conversations like this, people will see the connectedness between the things they care about and urban farming. So that's a little background about me and what brought me to this moment. And this is a new experiment. I asked yesterday on a planning call, have you done this before and with whom? And it's like, no, you're the first. So I feel like I'm a guinea pig here, but in the best sense of the analogy, because I really always want to introduce substantive legislation that can be significantly improved by those people who are closest to the pain and who also have the greatest expertise and lived experiences around the things I'm seeking to do legislatively. So your collective input today and until it gets enacted into law helps me be a better legislator. So I'm not just doing this for PASA as much as I love PASA. I'm doing it for myself because I want to make this the best bill in the entire state. So it's a symbiotic relationship here that I'm very excited about cultivating. And Lindsay, I want to acknowledge too that there may be folks who serve on the as staffers on the House Agricultural and Rural Affairs Committee on which I serve. So this initial audience, it can be quite diverse.
Yeah, thank you for that. So Rep, do you want to take us through the kind of the overview of HB 920 and give the attendees here today just a bit of a sense of what the bill is trying to achieve, what problems it's trying to solve, and how it goes about doing that?
Sure, and I appreciate this slide deck, which I did not prepare, but really love. It discusses the bones of the legislation. And just for context, folks, there may be things that aren't in the bill that you may like to see in the bill. Some may be appropriate, some may deserve a self-standing bill that is a complement to this. Also, not everything is discussed. This is a broad overview because we only have so much time and we want to make sure you just understand the scope of what this legislation seeks to do. Also know that even if you don't contribute today in terms of feedback, even if it's just asking questions or maybe you just listen in, there will be other opportunities to weigh in on this legislation. This is not the only time. It's not the last time. So don't get stressed if you don't ask the question you've been dying to ask, or you think of it after I'm always accessible, and I will put my information in the chat so you can reach out to me directly. I always like to be accessible to folks who want to help do the work. So this slide in front of us, establishment of UAZs. So those are urban agricultural zones. And so what we want to make sure to do is advance what could become a state law that encourages municipalities to not just create these zones, but to respect their operation. And so, as you see here, it requires UAZs to be cropland for property tax assessment. It prohibits cities from placing unreasonable restrictions on assessing special fees on UAZs and prohibits them from being established in ways that are unsuitable for the surrounding areas. So not all agriculture may be conducive to a particular community. Obviously, you want feedback from your neighbors. That's a process. Also, zoning is a labyrinth that, can be very frustrating for anyone who's dealt with a municipality. Like, how is this being able to be developed here, but not this, and all the rigmarole around that. But know that state law precedes local ordinances. So ideally, what we do here is make sure that municipalities respect what could be a new statute that creates urban agricultural zones, but that we're not competing, we're actually working together. And sometimes there are zoning ordinances that don't make any sense, or they're outdated, or they're conflicting, or they're confusing, all of those things. Well, this seeks to get clarity and support for UAZs, because it's one thing for them to exist on paper and in law. It's another thing for them to flourish with the support of local government. And that's, of course, what we want to see here. So additionally, the bill would establish minimum standards when cities enter into lease agreements with farmers in these zones. So right now, there's a minimum term length of 5 years, and property size is as small as, 1/10 of an acre to 3 acres. And then we also have things like cancellation fee if the city breaks the contract with folks operating in the zone, and a ban on prohibition of agricultural structures. Now, why is that important? If you're banning the very structures that facilitate urban agriculture, there's no point in having a zone. So again, there are things that could exist on paper and in law that are not actually, that could not actually be helpful if there are other things that conflict with that. So we're trying to think a couple steps ahead and figure out what's the best way for cities and the state to work together to make it easier for urban farmers to do what they do. So lastly, the bill would allow for farmers to pay reduced rates and connection charges for services provided by utility companies. That's very important because we're talking about it's only meaningful access if it's affordable, consistent, and safe. Accessible means that you don't have to go through undue red tape and bureaucracy to figure out what you need to do to farm in a zone. That's really important. So being intentional, being collaborative, we want to bake that into the legislation. And so while that is in there, there could be ways based on feedback that you provide today or at a later date that can help us dissolve a lot of that red tape. All right. And Lindsay, Dom, Noah, Sant, jump in as needed, but why do we need this? It's a fair question. It's an important question. Well, urban agriculture should flourish, and not in spite of systems, not in spite of local and state government, but because of. This should be a springboard, not a wall to find your way around. And so that's what this legislation seeks to do. It seeks to create a statute to make it easier to encourage, to support, to grow the urban farming community statewide, and give them the resources and the access to make that happen. And that's something that will not happen on its own. When you talk about 67 different counties, hundreds and hundreds of municipalities, it's a lot. And so the benefit of working with state lawmakers like me and working with the state legislature is state law supersedes what happens on the local level. Sometimes that's not great, but sometimes it can work when it's meant to not tamp down on what's good for cities, but to actually allow those cities to flourish. And specifically in this context, urban farmers. So because municipalities have their own zoning laws, it is a patchwork, which makes it very difficult, particularly for those of you who may operate out of multiple localities in different counties. That's a problem. We know that utility rates are unduly expensive. You should have affordable, consistent, safe access to the utilities you need to for your agricultural operations. And then you also have other very practical considerations around animal control. I heard in the hearing that we had at the House Agriculture Committee in Pittsburgh a couple of months ago, that there are any number of issues you experience that aren't really being resolved well, consistently, quickly, methodically. And we need to address those issues and bake that into the legislation so that you have the supports you need as urban farmers. And I do see questions, and I will happily address them, and the PASA team can jump in as well. So benefits of this bill. So expands access to healthy, culturally relevant food in food apartheid neighborhoods. Stimulates local economy, expands opportunities for folks often denied access to farming, increases property value of surrounding area, helps community reclaim underutilized land. I also want to lift up something that I heard on more than one occasion at the hearing, which is, urban farmers help remediate soil. Like, that's huge, because even if there's a vacant lot that remains vacant for a long time, there are heavy metals, there are all kinds of stuff there that are just sitting there that hurt residents of those communities, most notably folks who are immunocompromised, young people, elders, et cetera, folks with disabilities. And so having an urban farmer on your block or in your neighborhood benefits you, whether you know they exist, whether you eat their food, whether you buy their products. This helps the health of the environment in which we live and the built environment. So that is something also I want to lift up, because that was lifted up by farmers who spoke at the hearing. All right, so there are some questions here, along with questions you're going to have in the chat, no doubt. I will do my best to answer some of these. Some of these I'm going to have a more definitive answer, but know that these questions are cultivating the beginnings of a conversation that you all can remain a part of. Because again, for context, I always like to tell folks, if this is your first time engaging a state lawmaker or talking about this issue through a policy lens, the context is really important, because if this conversation goes very well today, it doesn't mean the law will take effect tomorrow. It doesn't work that way, right? So what is the process? And so as we consider these questions and talk about them and have the answers influence the next iteration of this bill, it will have to go to a committee. That committee will be the Agriculture Committee, on which I serve. You should know that in our state, which is the largest full-time state legislature in the country, we have about 24 standing committees. And so pretty much anything that deals with agriculture goes to the Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee. So this bill naturally goes to that committee. Well, it's up to the majority chair of the committee, which has 25 members, 14 Democrats and 11 Republicans. Why 14 Democrats? Because Democrats are in charge for the first time in 12 years. And that's what we decided, because we're in power. So there's 14 Dems, 11 Republicans. So that means you need to pass any bill or resolution out of a committee, you need at least 13 votes, because that's a simple majority. So even if all but one Democrat supports this bill and no Republicans do, it passes. When it passes, it goes to the House floor, but the majority leader decides what bills run. So if there's a delay, you all can, mobilize and say, we demand a speedy deliberation of this bill on the House floor. We want it to come up for a vote. And then it has to get 102 votes in order for it to pass out of the House. But then it has to go to the Senate. And then you need 26 votes for it to get passed out of the Senate. And then it gets signed. Long story short, it gets signed by the governor unless he chooses to veto it, which he most certainly wouldn't. This is not a bill that I think our esteemed governor would veto. We do have questions around how we make sure we get strong bipartisan support, which, is not easy. We're the last divided legislature of all states in the country. So there are 49 state legislatures that are controlled by the same party. And then there's Pennsylvania. So Democrats control the House and the Republicans control the Senate. And everything is politicized in Harrisburg. So all of that is context that you need to understand as it relates to what's taking us so long, what's the process, what's the delay. It's not me. It's not PASA. It's politics of the legislative process. The good news is if you are connected or in or from a rural community, you may have more influence on the passage of this bill than even me, because a lot of folks will see urban and they'll think Democrat. And if they think Democrat, they may think, I don't care, I'm against it because this helps Democrats and my supporters are not Democrats. And unfortunately, some of my colleagues think that way. Not all of them, but enough to be a problem. So we can discuss strategy at a later point. Let's get to these questions. Is this bill specific to municipally owned land? No, it's not. You could have private property. You could have you could own a vacant lot. This could be something that is in private hands, but it still would have to deal with zoning issues, and those zoning issues would have to conform to the new state law. So whatever zoning ordinances there are, remember, state law supersedes local ordinances. Federal law supersedes state law. So I'll give you an example. The minimum wage in Pennsylvania is $7.25. The federal minimum wage is $7.25. We could not pass a law to reduce the minimum wage. We cannot have it lower than the federal minimum. So if there are federal laws that address urban farming, which don't exist right now as such, we couldn't do anything less than. We could only do more than. But if there are zoning issues that can't conflict with what we're seeking to do here, those zoning ordinances would need to be updated. So that's a good thing. That's why you want to be supportive of this process, because you don't have to fight these battles in every municipality across our Commonwealth. That would be unwieldy, to say the very least. So would there be any long-term guarantees beyond the 5-year lease? That depends. That could be negotiated with a specific municipality, and you'd want that flexibility, because what may work in Philly may not work in Reading. And a lot of this stuff is the ink hasn't dried. So, we may get feedback from some of you that allows us to think about this differently, to make tweaks that make sense. You always want to have legislation that allows for some flexibility. If it's so rigid, it can't bend. And then when it's put into practice, it can break. Right. But then again, you don't want to have something so loosey-goosey that it doesn't amount to anything. And I've seen both extremes. So we want to find our way in the middle there. Could municipalities decide to include existing farms sprinkled through the city or municipality? Yeah. There aren't any restrictions that would be imposed by this if it became state law on municipalities who wanted to expand as long as it's not beyond the acreage that is ultimately decided on. And that's a conversation too. Why 3 acres versus 3.5 acres? Some of these things could be fairly arbitrary, but as we get closer to the finish line, these things can change. We also need municipal urban ag zoning codes at the local government level. Is this policy intended to incentivize municipalities to get those on the books, or at least restrict them from having things like agricultural structures? So it's I'm not going to say a carrot and a stick, because it's not so much, it's more of a pause button than a stick. So there are not a lot of things that like punish cities, but they would remove cities' abilities to get in the way of a new state law if those zoning ordinances are not, those zoning codes are not in line with what the new law seeks to do. So ideally, we work with our partners on the local level and say, because this new law supersedes the zoning codes you have in your municipality, we want to work closely with you to update those zoning codes. I mean, and here's the thing, this is meant to help cities and the urban farmers to make those cities healthier, safer, more inclusive, greener, all of those things. So this is not the state taking over cities. This is not the state saying, you don't know what you're doing, we're going to do it for you. Rather, this is a new pathway for meaningful collaboration to help urban farmers. So if they don't update their zoning codes, this new state law would still supersede whatever things may conflict, but it's in everyone's best interest if you update those zoning codes as quickly as possible so that we're in closer alignment. All right. Should I start looking at the chat, Lindsay?
I think go ahead to the next slide, because I know that the next slide at least has one question about farm stands on site, which was also a question that was mentioned in the chat. So yeah, if we want to hit that question, and then we can talk a little bit more about the language around qualified farmer that's in the bill. And I think there's some other, yeah, and then after that, we can start moving through some of these questions in the chat. And also want to encourage folks, if you want to ask your question out loud or have, you know, a more detailed kind of experience or story you want to share, please feel free to come off mute, just raise your hand and we can make sure that yeah, we make space for that. Thank you. So the question that we have here is about like selling on site. So within an urban ag incentive zone, would that provide protections for a grower who wants to sell on site, even if the neighborhood is zoned residential?
There is, I'm trying to find, let me see if I can find that in the bill, but there can be limitations on what's sold, I believe. And do we have a link for folks to the bill, or should I throw it in here?
Just dropped it in the chat, thanks.
On page 3, line 9, this talks about a qualified farmer, an individual entity that meets at least one of the following. The fourth thing is limited resource farmer with direct or indirect gross farm sales, not more than the current index value in each of the previous 2 years. So basically, this talks about the socioeconomic background of a farmer. Also above that, it talks about a family farm whose annual gross cash farm income is greater than or equal to $350,000, but less than $1 million. So that talks about who's allowed, who's considered a qualified farmer, but it doesn't talk about where that farming income comes from geographically. So I think that's going to be something that will be negotiated, because if folks want to keep a residential community residential and they don't want to their block or their neighborhood to change the culture dynamics significantly, then that's where negotiation would begin. Like, what is too much? what are reasonable criteria to determine what on-site sales, look like? What is the nature of those sales? What are the hours? What we don't want to do is have the state tell all municipalities how to manage that in their respective communities, because if you believe in local sovereignty, you want to make sure there's flexibility for local communities to decide that, but within limits. The short answer to me would be there should be availability to sell on site, but the process by which that is determined, the criteria, so forth, should be decided on the local level. And maybe there's flexibility. What works for Philly may not work for Pittsburgh, et cetera, et cetera. But that's a really important question that will be addressed by the time this bill reaches the House floor. With regard to qualified farmer, for those of you who've clicked on the link that takes you to the bill, you will see that qualified farmer is defined on page 2, starting on line 29. So it talks about geography, it talks about gross sales, it talks about social disadvantage, referencing folks based on race and ethnicity. Some of these terms are terms that have been used in other state laws that are fairly obsolete or even offensive. There are certainly terms that I don't use, that probably a lot of you don't use, that are government terms. And so by changing those government terms here, it might require changing those government terms everywhere, which I'm very supportive of, but that would make things that take a lot longer to effectuate. Nevertheless, I believe that these criteria are important, but can be tweaked. So for instance, if you go to page 3, line 3, when it talks about a mid-sized family farm, why is it 350 to $1 million? Does that band need to stay? Does it need to expand or contract? Anything that references folks operating a farm for 10 years or less, maybe it's 5 years or fewer years. I'm open. I don't have pride of authorship. So just because this is what's in the bill as introduced does not mean it's untouchable. And perhaps from feedback from all of you over a period of days and weeks, we can have better definitions, more expansive, more granular things. And so there may be criteria that we should add that aren't in here. I also, when talking about issues around social equity, one of the biggest determinants of inequity is financial wealth, household wealth in particular, far more meaningful than income. And let me give you an example. When I went to college, I found out that one of my schoolmates was John Rockefeller V. He had a bunch of money, but no income. He didn't need income because his family paid for everything. So he was technically a low income, student, but it was his vast family wealth that significantly increased the quality and range of opportunities for him in school and beyond. So we often talk about low income households, and that's important. But the reality is there are barriers to people based on race and ethnicity, irrespective of their class, as it relates to getting loans from banks, as it relates to entering various industries. There's a lot of discrimination and straight up racism that just talking about low income is not good enough. Now, for those of you who've been following the Supreme Court case of last year that basically dissolved affirmative action as we know it, there is a trend of right-wing activists with a lot of money who are seeking to sue anyone who is doing anything that relates to racial equity. So it may be that there's nothing that explicitly references race or ethnicity in the bill, but there are very close proxies to do it that can have the same positive impact. So this aspect of the bill may change in light of that, and also because we shouldn't confuse identity with impact. But it's important to acknowledge who are those folks who are most marginalized and minoritized in the agriculture community. I see here there's a question about, is the criteria for qualified farmers inclusive of urban growers who utilize ag tech like aquaculture? That's a great question. I don't know that there's anything that directly connects that. But
Hi,
I think,
sorry, I'll jump in.
please.
It was my question. Hi, guys. So I've been a certified chef, a hydroponic farmer in Philadelphia for about 10 years now. And a lot of the holdup with some of the resources comes from aquaculture not specifically being included when we're talking about farming, urban farming, technology, et cetera. So for instance, one of my schools because one of the things I do is I help some schools build like classroom gardens based on technology. In the urban environment, we're faced with obviously all the issues we've been talking about, like land insecurity. They don't have access to the lands outside to even sort of start a traditional farm in land that is not used or vacant. There's a bunch of red tape through that. So we've created a solution to do the gardens inside, utilizing urban farming technology in partnership with the Food Trust, the Department of Health, et cetera. So my business goes and we do lessons on that. However, when we're trying to get money or grants to expand on these things, to secure more professionals to help with the scope of the work, a lot of the language around the support is not inclusive of ag tech.
Gotcha. Okay.
Pennsylvania's really far behind. You know, we see all of the ways that ag tech has been innovative in creating real solutions for food insecurity, which really, in my opinion, is more like food apartheid, because you know, there's a ton of growers who are, you know, trying to do their own thing independently as best we can. However, the system that connects us all and really enacts the change that people need is missing.
Gotcha.
But that's my little 2 cents. I'm sorry.
No. Hey, no, this is how we learn. Dom caught it and put it in the chat. Aquaculture is explicitly mentioned on line 15 on page 2. So it's in
Thank
there.
you guys so much. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, Dom, because I did not remember that. This is one of about 100 bills I'm working on, so I have not committed the details to my memory. So thank you, Dom, for lifting that up, and thank you, Christina. This is what this is all about here, because if it weren't in there, I'd put it in there. Okay.
For Andy Bader, who dropped the question in the chat about on-site retail sales. Andy, I don't know if you wanted to come off mute to talk a little bit more about what prompted that question, and if you wanted to provide a little more context as to why you think that would be kind of an important thing to protect. And also,
Sure.
Don, I see you have a question. So after Andy, if you wouldn't mind coming off mute too and asking a little bit more about your question in regards to ag structures, that would be great.
Happy to discuss this issue. So this is an issue actually across all agricultural operations where they can be potentially more profitable if they're able to vertically integrate and market to the consumer from the farm. And so I'm aware of a few circumstances, both in suburbs, in rural areas, but also in urban areas where growers have attempted to build farm stands to sell product and have been discouraged from that. And I will also add that there's sort of a part B to this, and this was discussed a minute or so ago, the notion of what the product mix should be. You know, for a business to be successful, it's often necessary to sell complementary products. And so if I'm growing strawberries, it might be beneficial for me to sell shortcake mix and the heavy cream so a consumer can buy the strawberries and make strawberry shortcake. And so it's not necessarily the case that it works to sell just the product off a farm. So there's sort of two questions there.
Thank you for that. I can address the first part. When we talk about contract requirements with the municipality, you'll see on page 4, line 26, contract requirements. And then you can scroll down to an important provision on page 5, line 13, a provision stating no provision of the contract may prohibit the use of structures that support agricultural activity, including a tool shed, greenhouse, produce stand, or instructional space. So we want to make sure that, you know, zoning codes are in alignment with the statute that facilitates, you know, meaningful operations in urban agricultural zones. I believe that addresses some of your question. Is that fair?
Perfect, yes.
Okay, so the second piece I think is really important, particularly for those of us like myself who are not urban farmers. And when you talk about complementary, you know, growing complementary things, providing complementary products, this is the type of nuance and detail that I want to make sure is addressed in the bill appropriately, because we don't want restrictions that keep you from making those types of sales. Like, why, you know, it's that type of context that will improve what we do here. So is there a specific, is the question, can we sell like not things that we don't grow on site to complement things that we do? Is that the question, or?
I think that is a variation of the question.
Okay.
When we're selling product off a farm, we are also still competing with other large retail operations, the Walmarts of the world, et cetera. And so consumers have become very used to one-stop shopping. And so the notion that a consumer has to go to multiple locations in order to be able to buy fresh product from a farm is a little challenging. And so if a consumer can get more products from that urban or retail operation at a rural farm and do that one-stop shopping, that's also a key to the financial success of that farm.
That makes sense to me. Would you, for instance, so if you are competing with some of the big box stores and grocery chains and bodegas and whatever, would it be, I'm thinking of urban farmers who sell the same products from the same sources that Walmart does, on one side, on one extreme, and then others who are selling complementary products that they don't grow from other local producers that often don't make it into the bodegas and the big box stores. So I would have a problem if you were selling tasty cakes next to your organic strawberries, because that kind of defeats the purpose, right? In many senses, like you can have a local alternative to something that would be similar to, you know, that kind of snack or treat or what have you. But what I wouldn't want to do is open the door to selling whatever a farmer says is complimentary, even if that product is not made in Pennsylvania or it's not, you know, I think there'd have to be reasonable criteria for determining the proportion of sales that are not grown on site and the nature of those products. But I would also like to do it in ways that incentivize other local producers of food who may be, like, for instance, in my district, there's folks who make their own ice cream, make their own cookies and baked goods and so forth. I would much rather incent urban farmers to work with them than to sell things that you could buy, you know, at Walmart that may not even be, you know, made in this country or this state or what have you. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. And I look forward to seeing the discussion on that. I think that's a great direction that you've put forth.
I appreciate you saying that, because ultimately we want to create an environment, and pardon the pun, to, you know, to make it easier for urban farmers to be successful. So your point makes a lot of sense. It's not just about the growing, it's about being able to function as an enterprise. And that would require a more opportunity to sell complementary products. And I definitely want to make sure the bill is improved to address the concerns you raised. So thank you so much for raising it.
Thank you.
And Don, I don't know if your question about the agricultural structures is still live and relevant, but if it is, yeah, I'd appreciate you coming off mute just to provide a little bit of additional context.
Sure, and my comments are in the context of my former role in the Pittsburgh Food Policy Council. We worked with a team of folks back in 2017, I believe, to update our urban ag zoning code to be inclusive of structures and particular animals and improve the process, et cetera. And it took a significant kind of campaign and energy and all of that to work on that code at the municipal level. So I'm just trying to understand how something like this would, I've heard in other municipalities, I think like Erie or something, that you can't have different structures. So I don't know the sort of legal framework of municipal codes versus a state law like this, but that was sort of my question is like, because to your point, to go municipality by municipality is just really, really daunting. So I was just curious to hear more. I mean, you have spoken a bit on this, but just that was the context of my question. Okay,
that's helpful. So because state law supersedes local ordinances, that's helpful to address this, because was your campaign municipality specific? I just want clarity around that.
Yeah, we were working in the city of Pittsburgh specifically.
Okay, right. So then you have to go directly to them, to local government, and ask them to update their zoning codes to address X, Y, and Z, right? So if this is successful, this would supersede whatever those zoning codes are. But because this is a process, ideally what would happen is you would you would go to, let's say this passes out of committee, right? And it's significantly improved based on the feedback of folks like you and others from this period to the time it's voted out. You could go to your council members, county executive, whatever, and say, hey, look, this bill is moving in the legislature, which will supersede our zoning codes here in Pittsburgh. They're seeking to provide incentives for Pittsburgh area urban farmers and urban farmers statewide. Would you be willing to work with, a coalition, including, the state rep, to update your zoning codes so that we're all on the same page here? So it's not like it should make your job easier advocating on the local level, but what we don't want is saying, I don't care what the state did, and I'm going to drag my feet. We're going to go to court, and it'd be adversarial versus saying this new law would help municipalities and would help neighbors of farmers, would help farmers, et cetera, et cetera. Here's how we can improve these zoning codes in a collaborative and symbiotic way. So how we go about it matters as much as the individualized success of this bill.
One other thing I'm realizing that I see take this with what it is. It's like social media kind of banter and issues particularly around chicken keeping. And different municipalities, I don't know if this is a statewide thing or just in the southwestern part where I am, but there's often municipalities that are against chicken keeping, and people are in a whole thing. So anyway, just to kind of put that out there, that's some of the kind of push and pull on the ground. That issue seems to ruffle a lot of feathers.
Well said. Well, that makes me think of pickleball. I don't know, here in Philly, pickleball is a big thing. It's blowing up nationally. And the thing about, and tell me if this metaphor works for, chickens, but I suspect it does. The upside is that, we can produce our own eggs, and, it helps with the, soil reclamation, and it has all these positive things. It may also smell, it also may be loud. Pickleball is great for people who you don't need a lot of skill to play. So it's involving a lot of people from all generations. It's a much smaller footprint than tennis or basketball or baseball or football, cheaper equipment, right? Downside is there are a lot of injuries, There's also loud as hell. So if you are neighboring a pickleball court, you're pissed off all the time, right? So we know these things. The question is, what can we do to satisfy both groups? Because there's nothing inherently wrong with pickleball. There's nothing inherently wrong with chickens, right? How do we do it? And so if we approach it from a place of, this is not a problem, this is a challenge that can lead to an opportunity that benefits everyone. Because I assure you, the people who will automatically say, I don't want anyone having chickens near me, may have a different tune if there's not a pungent odor, if there's not it's not loud all the time, and they get free or deeply discounted eggs because they're next door to an urban farm. There are ways to incentivize, and more importantly, to structure the conversation, because we know why people are against chickens. We know why people are against pickleball courts. The question is, how do we address their needs before they even need to raise their opposition? I also addressed this when the cannabis law, medical cannabis, was legalized. And in my community, everybody, well, not everybody, a large percentage of folks were opposed to having a dispensary in their neighborhood, and most notably within blocks of where they live. And my point, which was not super popular at the time, was you actually want a dispensary near you, as long as it's cited appropriately in the right place, because it's going to be the safest business. It's going to create living wage jobs. It's going to provide products that actually help a lot of the folks who are most concerned about it. But if they didn't know that, all they thought of was all the bad stuff that they convinced themselves dispensaries represented, without actually knowing what the impact would be on their local community. I think the same is true of chickens. If you have no direct exposure to that, all you can think about is chicken poop and feathers and loud sounds, right? So I think that's something that we can work on simultaneously with improving the content of the legislation. And that's really a level of literacy that they're not going to get on their own, but that's something that we can do, because this ideally would provide greater opportunity for that and reduce the opposition to it, because we've done our homework and we figured out a messaging strategy that will resonate with people whose initial reaction is not in my backyard.
Great. Okay, so I see Sam has his hand raised. I wanted to address Jethro's questions. I think Jethro is going to come off mute. And then we have Tanya's question. Thank you, Tanya. I'm just replying in chat right now. So we'll do Jethro, then Tanya, and then Sam. All right. Thank you all.
Hello, Rep. Rab.
Hey.
And thank you for being here. Hey, good to see you, and thank you, PASA, for hosting this. My question, I have two now. One was already answered, thanks for the cut and paste by Dom. I was just thinking about a mix of uses that may be useful in an urban setting that maybe, sometimes happen in rural, but I think might be more likely in an urban setting, like a farm and a restaurant. More than one farmer working together who, reduce costs. A restaurant and a mushroom growing, freight container, lots of things like that I can imagine might be different in an urban setting. So I'm wondering if the bill that any ag use could also be allowed with a mix of other uses, particularly in a commercial context. And I think the second question is how to make sure that the one consequence of this is that it doesn't prevent, by codifying an urban agricultural zone, how to make sure it doesn't prevent current land that could go into agricultural uses being prevented from doing so. Let's say a campus, I'm thinking Northampton Community College has the East 40 now. It's 43 acres. It's now it's an agricultural use, but it is a college campus. I'm assuming zoned as such. I can imagine there being in urban settings, large tracts of land that could be agricultural uses. I'd hate for this bill to go forward and that codifying the agricultural zone would prevent currently non-agricultural zone parcels from adding agricultural uses. Hopefully that makes sense.
That's a great question. I don't
Thank
know,
you.
but yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that I want to look into, because yeah, you know, we don't want to have a situation where this actually hurts agricultural production or operations by being too restrictive or not thinking more broadly. So I'm making a note of that. I also think your point about, which is similar to the other gentleman who was talking about selling complementary products that they may not grow on site. The same with complementary operations, like, tree tapping and a restaurant or mushrooms or all those things. I think that absolutely should be more explicit in the bill, because that helps everyone. I mean, that's a win-win-win situation, particularly if the collaboration encourages local participants and local, offerings. So I think that's a great addition to the bill.
Thank you. So we have a question from Tanya. Tanya, would you be interested in coming after me just to share a little bit more about your question? Thank you.
No problem. So my question was, starts with a statement. Urban agriculture, a big part of it is the hobby farmer or the individual farmer and community gardens. How does this bill impact them, and how does it prevent municipalities from creating rules against farming in your own home? One particular one, I have 1,200 square feet of space in front of my house. I'm in the city of Reading, I'm downtown, but I cannot grow anything on that land except grass because there's regulations against it that I can only have turf and flowers. So how do we help encourage the cities or incentivize the municipalities from creating these kinds of rules or just taking them off of the books? Because we also have rules against collecting water. We have rules against chickens in the backyard. Even though I have the space, the rules are there. And there's a lot of suburban areas in my area who would love to have hobby gardens or just grow one item and just exchange it. Even if they're not selling, they would just like to grow something, but they can't.
I think there might be opportunity to address some of those things in the current bill that are not already addressed. And I also think there could be separate legislation, but I also think that there should be, and if PASA or other organizations aren't already doing this, is to catalog all of the anti-urban ag zoning codes, because a lot of these zoning codes are templates from other municipalities. It's like, oh, look what Philly did. We should do this to make sure chickens can't be, bothering people, in the row homes or something like that. So there may be a lot of similarity between these problematic zoning codes that you referenced for Reading. And there could be a grassroots campaign that is about informing local electeds and county officials about the negative impact of those zoning codes so that they can change. And it doesn't have to be from city to city. You could address all the municipalities that have similarly problematic zoning codes. But simultaneously, as I said, I think there may be room to address some of these things in this current bill, if amended appropriately, and perhaps a standalone bill that complements this, because there are a lot of statutes that have overcorrected because one influential constituent or donor or stakeholder group says, look at this, this was a bad experience we had, we need to prohibit this statewide, which is not good policy. So I think you raise a really, really important issue that can be addressed in multiple ways simultaneously. But my first interest is figuring out how to address the issue you raised to the extent I can in this specific piece of legislation. And as you know, when I referenced it, it's a qualified farmer, someone who is on a parcel that is 0.1, so 1/10 of an acre to 3 acres. I would imagine, I can't do the math, is 1,200 square feet smaller than a 1/10 of an acre?
You can find out because I have the same amount in the back.
Okay, well, it didn't say contiguous, so that would, you know, if you add those two things up and it's 1/10, and again, what we have is 1/10 could potentially be changed, but this is not about changing it to just help you, of course.
I know.
But your point is so much more valuable than just helping yourself. This is an issue about folks who are putting forth and supporting zoning codes that unduly prohibit important and healthy things that could help the local economy, could do many, many good things. And I think it's that knee-jerk reaction that a lot of folks have when something goes wrong. So they say, we're just not doing this. And that's not good policy. So I'm very interested to see what provisions could be added or tweaked in my bill to address those concerns.
And do we have anything about community gardens in this bill in reference to, again, helping municipalities augment them and make sure that they are there? Because every time I go to now they're very helpful here. I'm not even trying to say they're not, but there's no paperwork on how to do it. There's no guide. There's no person to talk to in our municipality about this. It's kind of like whoever helps you. And is there
Right.
anything in this bill to help the municipalities kind of create a point person who will be like the ag representative within their municipalities?
Sure, great question. So on page 7, line 1, it says, so these urban agricultural zones will be created by municipalities. So even though it's a state law, it authorizes municipalities to create these UAZs. And so a committee would be established, and that committee would consist of 6 members, and 2 members of the committee will be from elected officials from the municipality or appointed by the board. But the remaining 4 would be inclusive of folks who have urban farming, community gardening backgrounds. Now, I will say that there's a certain template that a lot of legislation leverages that creates committees, commissions, et cetera, that give outsized influence to elected officials to decide who's on those committees, which of course can be very problematic, deeply partisan and political. So I suspect that there may be tweaks to this portion of the bill because this is standard language, and I'm not a big fan of standard language unless it makes sense. But you'd want to make sure that the committee, the Urban Agricultural Zone Committee that is established by the municipality, is meaningfully and functionally diverse, is inclusive in strategic ways, and is truly equitable, and not just filled with, partisan hacks, right? People's cousins and big donors or whomever. So to your point, if you're talking about community gardening, you're talking about sustainable agriculture, you're talking about other things, we want to make sure that any committee created for the establishment of an urban agricultural zone is appropriately represented to address those issues. And that committee can also can help in terms of increasing the literacy and access to resources around how to start or grow or protect community garden, urban farm, et cetera, et cetera. But this can be improved on, and I really appreciate your comment and question.
Thank you.
Thanks. So we have Sam's comment and question, and then we'll move on to Diana. And then I think we have a couple more questions in the chat that we can get to after that as well.
Great.
So I have two things I want to bring up. The first one is the section that speaks on enforceable contracts with landowners. Can you speak more on that and kind of give an example of when this will be like enforced? And then the other one was when a contract is canceled by a landowner. Just bringing up like, does that mean like, say if the farmer is not the landowner and they're like kind of leasing from the landowner, if the contract is canceled, it doesn't say anything about a timeline for when I guess the farmer needs to be vacated. Like it says there would be a cancellation fee, but would there be like a timeline of when a farmer will be vacated?
I think that's a great question, right? Because it's not just about penalizing or discouraging a landowner from just willy-nilly canceling a contract, right? Okay, I won't do it because if I do, there's going to be this cancellation fee, right? If the cancellation fee is not big enough, then that's not really preventing some unscrupulous landowners say, I don't want you here anymore just because I don't want you or for whatever reason. But the other point you raise is crucial too, because if the cancellation goes through, does that mean the farmer has 24 hours, a minute, 2 weeks? So that has to be explicit, and it's not. Not that I can see here. That is absolutely a provision that should be added and made explicit and figure out what makes sense. Maybe it's based on, like, you probably can tell me what are the criteria that will determine how much time it would take to leave the premises, right? If they're agricultural structures, if it's a 3-acre farm versus a 1/10 of an acre farm, if it's in, high season, if it's X number of folks who are working there, or, any number of criteria. And equally important, Sam, is not just the criteria in and of themselves, but also like, what is the process, right? Like, what are the considerations to transition an urban farmer off the land in light of what's at stake for the disruption of that enterprise, right? Because it's not just a disruption to the urban farmer, but to any workers there, to the neighbors, to vendors, to consumers, to the built environment itself, to the natural environment, to the crops. Like, all of these things are considerations that are not explicitly referenced in the bill. So what is the process by which a municipality will effectuate to determine what is the appropriate amount of time after a contract has been canceled? And to me, it would make sense that that would be under the purview of the Urban Agricultural Zone Committee, that they would have the authority to determine, based on all these explicit criteria, what is the shortest amount of time that someone would need to leave a particular premises. And also, there's a difference between an individual just stopping what they're doing and removing every trace of that operation there, right? So if it were a vacant lot before and the contract is canceled, because, okay, we're not growing anymore, but you have a bunch of stuff, right? You have physical, implements, apparatus, equipment, et cetera, structures that need to be addressed. So it's both criteria and also the process, and who has the authority to make sure that that process is effectuated in a reasonable and humane way. So I think that's a really good point. I would imagine that would go under the same section that talks about enforceable contracts, could also be referenced when we talk about the Urban Agricultural Zone Committee in terms of its powers and responsibilities. But that absolutely needs to be included, and I really appreciate you bringing that up.
Thank you for coming off mute. You can go ahead and address your question. There's also one in the chat that I'll slot in after yours, and then Dan, you can go ahead after that. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Lindsay. Thanks, Rep Rob, for being here. And no, I hate to go backwards, but I wanted to piggyback off of what Tanya was talking about and, you know, this idea of incentivizing municipalities. You know, I'm in Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, we have an urban ag department. You can call someone to find out about how to do a community garden. And Christina here has shared, you know, the beautiful Philadelphia Urban Ag Plan, which is a separate thing. I think, you know, a real sticky point we have in Philadelphia is land access and how it gets kind of mucked up in this like Philadelphia land bank. And there's been all of this stuff in the press about how, you know, there's all this land that has been not utilized or underutilized, and or, you know, land is being used in ways in which it wasn't intended to be used. And so I'm just wondering if there's any in this bill, any way of addressing incentivizing municipalities to be using land, especially underutilized land, in ways that would be beneficial for urban agriculture.
That's great background and a great question. I can tell you that I would love to include something in the bill to do just that. And if you have suggestions, you or anyone else, now or at a later point, I would love to consider those things to improve the bill, because I think that would be imperative to do. I also want to address the fact that you mentioned how some municipalities are, you know, have urban ag plans and have resources or offices or other things that promote urban farming. What I don't want to do is create an undue bureaucracy where you have this new urban ag zone committee that duplicates what another governmental or quasi-governmental entity may already be doing. So perhaps in the composition section of UAZ committees can be an ex officio role of any local or county entity operating in a municipality that already has exclusive or primary mission around urban farming, community gardening, et cetera. That way, you're not creating multiple entities that are potentially competing for resources or have overlapping authorities, creating more bureaucracy, but they are tapped into something that acknowledges that not all municipalities are starting at zero. And we want to leverage any momentum and infrastructure that already exists for municipalities that you know, affirmatively embrace urban agriculture. So that's definitely one improvement we can make as relates to the composition and mission and resources of a UAZ zone. I think that makes a lot of sense. And there's language we can put in there that creates that opportunity and that necessity to say, if there are pre-existing entities that have this mission, they need to be included on this committee. So that's definitely something that we can and should do. And that's a great contribution to this conversation. As it relates to the other piece, which is no less important that you raised, regarding how do we get folks to, how do we incentivize municipalities to free up land that's already in their control? I don't know, but we need to, and I would like to include that in the bill. So that is a conversation I'd like to continue with you and others who may, you know, think of ideas for incentives to do that.
Great, thank you. Happy to be involved.
Wonderful. I'm loving this, by the way. You have no idea. If this is the first time you've ever gone through a bill with the legislator, please know that this is the first time that, you know, most of my colleagues have never done this, right? And this is, I've done this for a few of my bills in a similar fashion, but this is aggressively fabulous. So this is as meaningful to me as the author of the bill as it may be meaningful to you. So just, I want to put that out there.
Yeah, aggressively fabulous. I love that description. So we have a question in the chat from Sarah, and Sarah, feel free to hop off mute with some additional context. And I think we've addressed this a little bit, but just want to make sure that we name it outright. So Sarah's question is, would you have to update local zoning codes if the incentive zones override them? And then after addressing Sarah's question, we will go ahead to Dan's question.
Yeah, just for some additional context, I put that in the chat as like a partial response to the answer that Dawn got for her question. So that's what that's from.
So yeah, you wouldn't have to, but you should. Yes, so because state law supersedes local ordinances, which address zoning codes, that wouldn't need to happen, but you do. If you don't encourage the municipality to know that this is coming down the pike and that these zoning codes will be outdated and in conflict with the new law, you want to give them a heads up. Obviously, if this were moving along and it looked like it'd be state law, I would be actively working with municipalities and counties. I'd be working with associations like the Pennsylvania Municipal League, the Pennsylvania Association of Towns and Boroughs, I believe, to be proactive and say, hey, look, we're not gunning for you here. We're trying to work together. FYI, this is going to impact, what you are doing on the local level. Why don't we work on zoning code updates that can benefit multiple municipalities at the same time? And for those folks who are, are less open to that, then we got to employ other strategies. But the reality is we're going to have a lot of time, a lot of runway to see if this is moving forward, to see, how this is implemented. So there will be plenty of time to engage in good faith with local leaders to say, hey, look, when this becomes state law, these zoning codes will be obsolete, will be in conflict with a new state law. And so how can we work together to update them appropriately? And also, let's remember that, let me be transparent here. Like I said at the beginning, I have 68,000 bosses. We don't like to piss off the majority of our bosses, particularly the ones that vote, right? That's the reality, right? So if you're an elected official who's only worried about, oh, I don't want to get into trouble, I don't want to bring up something that's going to be controversial and I'm not going to get reelected, then we need to help those, let's say, less than enlightened elected officials by saying, this won't hurt you, this will help you. And this will help you because these updated zoning codes will create more opportunities, will address concerns around odors and misuse of property and all the things that keep you up at night. So let's work together. If you do that kind of affirmatively and in a preemptive way, you're more likely to get this done versus saying, hey, well, we're just going to work on Rep. Rabb's bill. We're going to get it passed and screw everyone on the local level. That probably wouldn't be a good idea. I don't think anyone on this call would advocate for that approach. But even though those zoning codes would become obsolete with new state law, if the people don't know that, they can govern poorly, not knowing that what they're doing is it's in conflict with state law. And that's going to lead to undue litigation, which doesn't help anyone. So all of these concerns that you raise are very realistic and important, but the better news is we have plenty of time to educate folks about the possibilities and how this is really not about giving more headaches to people, but really about working in good faith in a collaborative way to lift all boats.
Thanks. And then, so before we move on to Dan's comment, I just want to note that it is 2:54, so we're coming up on the 90-minute mark. And I want to make sure that Rep. Rabb, you have the opportunity to drop your contact information in the chat because, as we've mentioned, this is hopefully just the first opportunity to have some meaningful conversations about what this bill could look like. And then I believe Maeve will probably drop an evaluation link in the chat. So, please offer any feedback that you have about the structure of this event and what you think PASA could do more of in the future. And also just want to make sure that if folks have to drop off right at 3 p.m. that we take a moment to thank Rep. Rabb for joining us here today and for creating this amazing space to have these conversations. I think we all feel really grateful for that. So with that, I will pass it over to Dan for your question and then, yeah.
Hey, Dan.
Hello. I guess this is maybe a good jumping off point at the end of the session here, just to say that I think that this sets a really nice baseline and floor in support of urban ag activity, but I think that there is a whole realm of activities that are yet to be supported in the future, and additional support can be cultivated. There's a lot of uncompensated work going on urban ag sites that is just unacknowledged and creates a lot of drag, which I see represented in the high turnover among urban farm managers. People burn out their startup capital, they burn up their enthusiasm, their friends stop coming to volunteer, all of that, over time, and trying to create and build more sustainability into those systems. So we mentioned soil remediation earlier, and finding ways to provide support and compensation for that valuable service, access to green space. Community education, both youth and adult community education, I think can't be overestimated in its value. And then just more generally, I mean, Andy mentioned some of the practical realities of being profitable. We have our diversified vegetable financial benchmark study that I might point you to, and there are only 4 or 5 levers that are available to growers to be profitable and be successful financially. Whether you're for-profit or nonprofit, you still have to be sustainable. And really, urban growers are scale limited out of several of those already. So there are only a few levers to pull on in terms of being successful. So the more that we can be responsive to the needs that folks are expressing, as well as the challenges that we know that are being encountered out there, and we can adapt our systems and our agencies and our services to be responsive to that, I think the more successful we'll be overall.
Thank you. And let me put in a pitch for ideas for other bills. Okay, so I want you to consider me first, not the only one, but I want you to consider me first for bold, innovative, pro-urban farming bills and related things, because I remain on the Agriculture Committee, and the reason I stay on it is because the things that I care about most intersect with these things right here. So consider me a resource, and if I act in good faith in this process for this bill, maybe that will earn your trust for us to work together on ideas you have for other bills. And I love to brag on my bills, ... that have been inspired by constituents, residents, citizens, whomever. I get to brag and say, I had someone who entrusted me with their idea and was able to enact something into law because they came to me with something that they didn't know who to come to, and they came to me, and we were able to do something together. So I think that's a great comment around that. This is just the beginning. This is just a small portion of all the things we can do to promote sustainable and urban farming. And I'm here for it. I also want this type of exposure because I want to continue learning at a fast pace. And the more I deal with the aggressive fabulosity of the folks of you on this call and beyond, I get to be a better lawmaker, which is really important to me. So very interested in that. And again, I put my information in the chat, my email, my Instagram and Facebook, RepRab, and my website. If you email me, I will respond to you personally, okay? I'm not pushing you off to my staffers. Just be patient with me because, like I said, I do have 68,000 bosses. And I guess the other piece I want to mention really quickly is if we can have a follow-up at the appropriate time, because one of the things that I'm planning to do is with PASA is process these remarks in an upcoming meeting I'm having with staffers at the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. Because if I didn't mention it on the front end, I've been told multiple times, including by the secretary himself, that he's very interested in this bill. And that's not something I'm used to hearing. So I'm going to make sure that this is, we fully leverage this opportunity in front of us and get this going. And that's only going to help with continued involvement of all of you, because you are experts. I'm an expert in a very narrow way legislatively, but you are experts on the front lines, and I deeply, deeply respect your opinions and your contributions. And I hope you will see that reflected in the next version of the bill when I submit an amendment to my own bill for consideration in a committee vote that I hope will happen this fall. I very much want to have that happen. And if that's all that happens before the end of this legislative term, that's progress, because what that means is early in the new legislative term, in January or February, I can reintroduce the latest version of the bill, and we won't have to go through all of this. And we can have greater, a faster pace, hopefully, with more stakeholders, a stronger ground game to encourage more bipartisan support of this and perhaps other bills.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. And yeah, please keep the lines of communication open, and we look forward to yeah, continuing to make space for these sorts of conversations. So yeah, with that, I wish you all a good afternoon.
Thank you, Pasa. Thank you, all of you, and Bidwell. Thank you for hosting the hearing a couple months ago. Looking forward to working with you all again soon.